One of the games car owners like to play is to see just how far they can go on a tank of gas. Even though they have the fuel gauge there on the dashboard, they still feel compelled to go as far as they can before they pull off into a gas station to refill the tank. It would be nice as we travel through life if we had such a fuel gauge for our own lifetime and for planet Earth. The good news is there's about 1.5 billion years left in the tank for planet Earth, in which life will continue to exist until the intensifying heat of the sun finally extinguishes the last living organism. The bad news is, in terms of creating a gauge for human life, it's all but impossible. There's just too many variables to be taken into consideration to develop an accurate instrument. Now, the author Oliver Burkeman says that we could actually use the metric of 4,000 weeks or 80 years as what is in our fuel tank when we're born. He calls this state of being finitude. And he calls on us in our lives to engage in what he calls last time reflections. So as we go through life and we encounter different experiences, he asks us to approach those as if it was for the final time, so that we could wring from that experience as much as possible. Berkman's concept of finitude reminds me of a painting that was in my home growing up. There was an inscription on the painting from John Keats's poem, "When I have fears that I may cease to be." Rather haunting words for a fourth grader who at the time was operating under the premise that I was immortal. Something that some people still subscribe to today. Keats's poem serves as a spoiler alert for the last sentence of the last chapter of our lives, and that is, we die. The Latin phrase for this is memento mori, or remember, you must die. Memento mori is one of those few absolute truths that has transcended both spatial and temporal boundaries. Despite our mistaken belief that we won't suffer that fate, in the end, we concede to our human condition and the fact that we all must die. A perfect example of memento mori is found in a church, the Santa Maria dei Cappuccini, north of Rome. In the 17th century, the cardinal ordered the remains of the Capuchin friars to be exhumed and brought into the crypt of the church, which was divided into 5 chapels. One of the chapels had the following inscription: "What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be." Indeed, centuries before that, Buddha reminded us that we begin to die from the moment we are born. From the beginning of time, we have feared death. It has remained for us a conceptual je ne sais quoi. In our attempt to try to come to terms with our own mortality, we've engaged our imagination to imagine the unimaginable, to personify death. As with Jung's collective unconscious, we've had a collective desire to give anthropomorphic form to death, an attempt to try to exercise control over death. We've made it part of the zeitgeist. We've tried to normalize death as part of the zeitgeist by bringing it in as a character in film, in television, in music, in literature, making death all but ubiquitous in popular culture writ large. It's within this context we experience death on an unprecedented scale during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this caused us to pause and talk about a topic that far too long was taboo: death. As we reflected on our mortality, we started to look not only at death, but look at life itself. And in doing so, trying to learn lessons about that, we borrowed figures of death, Dr. Beakey, the Grim Reaper, from a previous period in history in which we experienced death on an unprecedented scale. The bubonic plague of the mid-1300s, also known as the Black Death. So we went back to the 14th century to try to learn lessons so that we could apply that to the 21st century to help guide and inform us in what we did and how we responded. This attempt to try to reflect on the balance between life and death is further explained by Stephen Cave's theory of the mortality paradox, where he writes, on the one hand, we all acknowledge the fact that one day we will die. But on the other hand, we just can't conceive of our own state of non-existence. In other words, death presents itself as both inevitable and impossible. A century before that, Sigmund Freud wrote the same thing. He said it is absolutely impossible for us to imagine our own death, for deep inside, we all still believe in our immortality. Even when we know death is near, we still cling to the belief that we can challenge death one more time in order to stay alive. We see this throughout recorded history. In Queen Nefertari's tomb in the 1200s, there's this painting of Queen Nefertari playing the game of Senet against an invisible character suspected to be death. We see it in the 15th century with Albertus Pictor's painting of a man playing the game of chess against death, which was the inspiration for Ingmar Bergman's 1957 film, The Seventh Seal. And most recently, we've played that game of chess with death in trying to find a vaccine to treat the coronavirus during the COVID-19 pandemic. And today, we're turning to technology to see if maybe technology will be that opponent that can finally defeat death and help us to achieve digital immortality. See, we're in a race with death and a race with time. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo reminds us that one of the most powerful influences on our thoughts, on our feelings, and on our actions is time. And yet, we seldom reflect on the role that time plays in our lives. And this is what Zimbardo calls the time paradox. We see that reflected in a question posed a century ago by the poet Henry Austin Dobbin. He asked the question of whether time or we pass. And as you can see from his poem, he answers, time stays, we go. End-of-life doula Marianne O'Hara, throughout her career, worked with individuals who were facing death. And what she found, the most common regret they had was that they always thought that they had more time. And therefore, they took the future for granted. Taking the future for granted is not just something exhibited in those that are facing death. It's also something that their family members exhibit as well. I recall when my mom was battling cancer, I was a professor in Indiana, and my family and I were going to be heading home for the holidays. But before we left, I had to go back to the campus, had to do something at my office, which delayed our departure. But soon we embarked on that 5-hour trip from Indiana to Illinois, to my mom's home, my childhood home. And about an hour outside of my mom's home, my brother called to let me know that our mom had passed away. To this day, I don't recall what it was that I had to do on campus that delayed our departure, but I'll never forget the fact that I wasn't there when my mom died. So it's no surprise that O'Hara found, in working with those individuals that were facing death, that the most common realization that they had was that love is all that truly mattered. Death is a teacher, and we are the students. Psychologist Carl Jung calls on us to accept death so that we can learn what it has to teach us about life. Bronnie Ware was a palliative care worker, and she too worked with individuals at the end of their lives. They too expressed regrets that they had. And she turned those into lessons for the living. And her takeaway from those years of working with those individuals centered around courage. And what she calls on us to do is to adopt what she calls a habit of courage. And once we've done that, we need to get out of our own way so that we can take courageous action every day. Robert Hertford reminds us of the irony of death, the fact that it teaches us so much about life, but it's only at the end of our journey. One individual who was actually able to teach that lesson after they died was the actor Yul Brynner, who played Ramesses II in the Ten Commandments. Brynner had been diagnosed with lung cancer, and he made the decision to create a public service announcement, a commercial for the American Cancer Society. He wanted to teach that lesson about anti-smoking after his death, literally from the grave, to others so that they could avoid his same fate. Our challenge is to harness our fear of death and to engage what Dan Kaplan calls optimizing for death. In other words, seize those opportunities that come to us in life. Be willing to take chances and be open to new experiences that come our way. One of the most powerful lessons that we derive from death was given to us 500 years ago by the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. He observed that living consists not in the length of days. In other words, it's not how much time we have, but it's what we do with that time. It's how we use that time. As a result, our challenge is not with death, it's with ourselves. To make the absolute best of every day as if it were our last. Thank you.